Tuesday morning at Buckingham Palace looked like any other day. The sun was shining through the clouds over London, and tourists were already gathering behind the famous black iron gates. People from all over the world stood there with their phones and cameras, hoping to catch a glimpse of the royal guards in their bright red uniforms and tall black hats. The guards stood perfectly still at their posts, like living statues. They didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even seem to breathe. This is what everyone came to see. Children pointed and giggled, trying to make the guards smile or move. Parents took countless photos, and tour guides told the same stories they'd been telling for years. But in this crowd of happy tourists, one person was different. A 28-year-old man from South London had come to the palace that morning, but not to take pictures or learn about history. His name doesn't matter much to this story, but his troubles do. This man had been struggling for months. He'd lost his job as a car mechanic 6 months earlier, when the garage he worked at closed down. Since then, he'd been bouncing from one temporary job to another, never making enough money to pay his bills. The rent was 3 months behind, and his landlord had already threatened to kick him out. Things got worse when he started drinking more to forget his problems. What began as a few beers after work turned into drinking every day. Soon he wasn't just drinking beer anymore. The alcohol made everything seem less terrible for a while, but it also made it harder to find work and keep his life together. His family had tried to help at first. His mother offered to let him move back home, but his pride wouldn't let him. His sister tried to get him into treatment programs, but he always made excuses. Slowly, one by one, the people who cared about him started to give up. They were tired of the broken promises and the lies about getting clean. By this Tuesday morning, he was desperate. He owed money to people who weren't the type to just send polite reminders. These were dangerous people who had already made it clear what would happen if he didn't pay them back soon. The fear of what they might do kept him awake at night. He'd been walking around London for hours, his mind racing with crazy thoughts. Nothing made sense anymore. He blamed everyone for his problems. The government, rich people, the royal family living in their fancy palaces while he couldn't even afford food. The anger inside him was growing stronger every day. That's what brought him to Buckingham Palace that morning. He stood in the crowd, but he wasn't looking at the guards the same way everyone else was. While other people saw tradition and ceremony, he saw something else. He saw symbols of everything he thought was wrong with the world. The tourists around him were laughing and having fun, but he could barely contain his rage. A family next to him was speaking in a foreign language, probably spending more money on their vacation than he'd seen in months. A group of teenagers was taking selfies, their phones probably worth more than everything he owned. He watched the guards standing there so calmly, so confident. They had jobs, steady pay, respect. They were protecting people who lived in unimaginable luxury, while ordinary people like him suffered. The unfairness of it all felt like a weight crushing down on his chest. What he didn't know was that those guards weren't just dressed up for show. Each one was a real soldier, trained for combat, ready for anything. The rifles they carried weren't props or decorations. They were real weapons, loaded and ready to use if needed. He also didn't know about the dozens of hidden cameras watching every corner of the palace grounds, or the plainclothes security officers mixed in with the crowds, or the armed police positioned at strategic points around the area. Buckingham Palace might look like a tourist attraction, but it's actually one of the most heavily guarded places in Britain. As the morning went on, his thoughts became darker and more confused. The alcohol and lack of sleep weren't helping him think clearly. Everything felt like it was someone else's fault, and he was tired of being powerless. He wanted to do something that would matter, something that would make people notice him and his problems. Standing there in that crowd of happy tourists, looking at those perfectly still guards, an idea began forming in his mind. It was a terrible idea, the kind that would change his life forever. But in his current state, it seemed like the only way to make his voice heard. The morning was still young, and hundreds of people continued to arrive at the palace gates. Tour buses dropped off excited visitors who rushed to get the best spots for photos. Street performers entertained the crowds, and vendors sold souvenirs nearby. It was a perfect, ordinary day at one of London's most famous attractions. Nobody in that cheerful crowd could have guessed what was about to happen. They were all just enjoying their day, taking pictures, making memories. The guards continued their silent watch, professional and alert but not expecting any real danger from the crowd of tourists. But danger was there, hidden behind the face of just another visitor. Sometimes the biggest threats come from the most unexpected places, from people who look just like everyone else in the crowd. This was about to become one of those days that nobody would ever forget. As the morning continued, something started to change. The man who had seemed like just another tourist was beginning to act strangely. At first, nobody really noticed. Crowds at Buckingham Palace are always full of excited people, and sometimes visitors get a bit loud or enthusiastic. But this was different. He started pacing back and forth behind the railings, his movements getting more agitated with each step. While other tourists stood calmly taking photos, he couldn't seem to stay still. His hands were shaking and sweat was forming on his forehead despite the cool morning air. A woman from Australia who was visiting with her family later told reporters what she saw. She said the man kept walking in circles, muttering things under his breath that nobody could understand. At first she thought maybe he was just talking on a phone call through earbuds, but she realized he wasn't wearing any. The muttering got louder. Soon other people in the crowd could hear him complaining about the government, about rich people, about how unfair everything was. His voice had an angry edge that made people uncomfortable. Parents started moving their children away from him without really knowing why. A security camera mounted on a nearby building captured everything. The footage would later show him becoming more and more aggressive as time passed. He began pointing at the guards and making gestures that looked threatening. His whole body language screamed that something was wrong. An elderly couple from Germany noticed him arguing with other tourists. They watched as he got into a heated discussion with a young man who had politely asked him to lower his voice. The argument escalated quickly, with the troubled man shouting about how tourists didn't understand what real people were going through. The young man he was arguing with just wanted to enjoy his day at the palace. He had saved up for months to take a trip to London with his girlfriend. When he asked the agitated man to please keep it down because families with children were nearby, he had no idea he was talking to someone on the edge of a complete breakdown. That's when things got really concerning. The man started yelling about the royal family, saying things that made everyone around him uncomfortable. He wasn't just complaining anymore. He was making statements that sounded almost like threats. The people near him started backing away, creating a small circle of empty space around him. A mother with 2 young children quickly gathered her family and moved to a different part of the crowd. She later said she felt something was seriously wrong with the man, even though she couldn't explain exactly what it was. Sometimes people can sense danger before they can put it into words. The palace security team has officers dressed in regular clothes mixed in with the tourist crowds. These undercover guards are trained to spot potential problems before they become serious. On this morning, at least 2 of them had noticed the unusual behavior and were quietly moving closer to get a better look. But the area around Buckingham Palace is huge, and there are always hundreds of people there. Even with all their training and technology, security teams can't watch every single person every single second. Sometimes someone slips through the cracks just long enough to cause real trouble. The man's behavior was getting worse by the minute. He started walking right up to the iron railings and gripping them with both hands, staring intensely at the guards on the other side. Other tourists gave him even more space, sensing that something bad might be about to happen. One of the guards later reported that he had noticed the man's unusual focus. Guards are trained to be aware of everything happening around them, even though they have to stand perfectly still. This particular guard said he felt the man's stare like a physical weight, and it made him more alert than usual. The man began shaking the railings slightly, testing their strength. This caught the attention of more people in the crowd. Several tourists took out their phones, not to take pictures of the guards anymore, but to record what looked like someone having a mental breakdown in public. A tour guide who had been working at the palace for over 10 years said she had never seen anyone act quite like this. She quietly radioed for additional security, following the protocol for situations that seemed like they might get out of hand. The troubled man seemed completely unaware that people were watching him and growing concerned. He was lost in his own world of anger and desperation. All he could think about was how unfair his life had become, and how the people in that palace represented everything he couldn't have. His movements became more erratic. He would walk away from the railings, then suddenly rush back and grab them again. He kept looking around as if he was planning something, but nobody could guess what. The security cameras captured every moment, creating a record that would later be studied by experts trying to understand how the situation had developed. They would point to this period as the critical time when intervention might have prevented what was about to happen. But in the moment, with hundreds of people around and dozens of small dramas playing out in the crowd, it wasn't obvious that this one person was about to cross a line that would change everything. Sometimes the most dangerous situations develop right in front of everyone, hiding in plain sight until it's too late to stop them. At exactly 11:47 in the morning, everything changed in an instant. The man who had been pacing and muttering suddenly stopped moving. For a moment there was an eerie calm, like the quiet before a storm. Everyone around him seemed to sense that something was about to happen. Then, without any warning, he exploded into action. He broke away from the crowd with a speed that shocked everyone. His legs pumped hard as he sprinted directly toward the iron railings that separated the public from the palace grounds. The tourists who had been watching him nervously suddenly realized they were witnessing something far more serious than just someone having a bad day. Screams erupted from the crowd as people understood what was happening. A man was actually trying to break into Buckingham Palace in broad daylight, right in front of hundreds of witnesses. Parents grabbed their children and pulled them back. Elderly visitors stumbled as they tried to get away from the chaos. The railings around Buckingham Palace are tall and ornate, designed to look beautiful but also to keep people out. They're made of solid iron and topped with decorative spikes. They're not easy to climb, but desperation can give people incredible strength and determination. The man hit the railings running and immediately started climbing. His hands gripped the iron bars as his feet scrambled for footing on the decorative elements. Several tourists later said they couldn't believe how fast he was moving. Adrenaline and pure determination seemed to give him abilities he normally wouldn't have had. Security alarms began blaring immediately. The palace has sensors all along the railings that detect when someone tries to climb them. Within seconds, a piercing siren was wailing across the area, adding to the chaos and confusion. The sound was so loud that some people covered their ears. The guards who had been standing perfectly still suddenly came to life. Their training kicked in automatically. While they maintained their positions, they were now on high alert, ready to respond to whatever was about to happen. Years of practice had prepared them for exactly this kind of situation. As the man reached the top of the railings, he paused for just a moment. Maybe reality hit him and he realized how crazy what he was doing really was, or maybe he was just catching his breath before the final push. From up there, he could see the palace grounds stretching out in front of him, looking both magnificent and forbidden. Then he jumped down to the other side. The moment his feet hit the palace grounds, every security protocol in the building activated at once. Lights flashed in control rooms throughout the palace. Radio chatter exploded as different security teams coordinated their response. This wasn't just a drunk tourist anymore. This was a full-scale security breach at one of the most important buildings in Britain. The crowd of tourists was in complete panic now. People were running in all directions, not sure where to go or what to do. Some were trying to get as far away as possible, while others were pulling out their phones to record what was happening. The scene looked like something from a movie, except this was completely real. Children were crying as their parents rushed them away from the chaos. Tour guides were trying to maintain control of their groups while also calling for help on their radios. Street vendors abandoned their stalls and ran for safety. In just a few seconds, what had been a peaceful tourist attraction turned into a scene of complete mayhem. The man seemed surprised by how quickly he had made it over the railings. He stood there for a moment, looking around the palace grounds as if he couldn't believe where he was. The reality of what he had just done was starting to sink in, but it was too late to turn back now. Palace security cameras tracked his every movement from multiple angles. In control rooms throughout the building, trained professionals were already analyzing the situation and coordinating the response. They could see that the intruder appeared to be alone, but they couldn't know for sure if this was part of a larger plan. The man started moving across the palace grounds, but he seemed unsure of where to go or what to do next. His original plan, if he had one at all, hadn't really extended beyond getting over the fence. Now that he was inside, the magnitude of what he had done was becoming clear. Armed police officers were already racing toward the palace from multiple directions. Special units that are always on standby for exactly this kind of emergency were mobilizing, Helicopters would be in the air within minutes. The entire area was about to be locked down completely, but the most immediate danger was still developing right there on the palace grounds. The man's eyes had fixed on something that made the situation infinitely more serious. He had spotted one of the guards standing at his ceremonial post near the main entrance. And more importantly, he had noticed the rifle the guard was carrying. What happened next would be talked about for years to come. It would be analyzed by security experts, studied by law enforcement agencies, and remembered by everyone who witnessed it. The man who had started the day as just another face in the crowd was about to attempt something that would shock the entire world. The peaceful Tuesday morning at Buckingham Palace was over. What came next would test every system, every protocol, and every person whose job it was to keep the royal family and the public safe. Now inside the palace grounds, the man found himself in a place where very few unauthorized people had ever been. The manicured lawn stretched out around him, and the massive palace building loomed ahead. But he wasn't thinking about the history or the grandeur of where he was. His mind was focused on something much more dangerous. About 50 feet away, standing perfectly still at his ceremonial post, was one of the Queen's guards. The guard wore the traditional red uniform and tall black hat that tourists love to photograph. But what caught the intruder's attention wasn't the colorful uniform. It was the rifle the guard was holding. The SA-80 assault rifle is standard equipment for the guards at Buckingham Palace. Most tourists think of it as just part of the costume, like a prop in a play, but these weapons are completely real and fully loaded. The guards aren't just dressed up for show. They're active-duty soldiers with real military training and real weapons. The man's desperate mind latched onto the rifle like it was the answer to all his problems. In his confused state, he thought that if he could get hold of a weapon, somehow everything would change. Maybe people would finally listen to him. Maybe he could force someone to pay attention to his struggles. He started walking toward the guard, his steps getting faster with each stride. The guard, whose name we'll call Johnson, noticed the movement immediately. Guards are trained to be aware of everything happening around them, even though they have to stand still and look straight ahead most of the time. Johnson had been a soldier for 8 years before being selected for ceremonial duties at the palace. He had served in Afghanistan and had been in real combat situations. He knew the difference between a tourist taking pictures and a real threat approaching him. As the man got closer, Johnson could see something wild and desperate in his eyes. This wasn't someone who was lost or confused about where visitors were allowed to go. This was someone who meant trouble. Johnson's grip on his rifle tightened slightly, and he prepared himself for whatever was about to happen. The intruder was now just 20 feet away, then 10 feet, then 5. Other guards stationed around the palace grounds had also noticed what was happening and were moving into position. But the man was moving fast, and the situation was developing too quickly for anyone to intercept him before he reached Johnson. Then, in a moment that would be replayed on security cameras and analyzed by experts for months afterward, the man lunged forward with both arms extended. His hands reached directly for Johnson's rifle, trying to grab it and pull it away from the guard. For a few terrifying seconds, both men had their hands on the weapon. The intruder was pulling with desperate strength, trying to wrench the rifle free. Johnson was holding on with all his training and experience, knowing that letting go of his weapon could lead to disaster. The rifle was caught between them, pointing in different directions as they struggled. This was exactly the kind of situation that security experts have nightmares about. A loaded weapon in the hands of someone unstable could lead to multiple casualties in seconds. People watching from outside the palace grounds could hardly believe what they were seeing. Tourists who had come to London for a peaceful vacation were witnessing what looked like a life or death struggle right in front of one of the world's most famous buildings. The man was shouting incoherently as he fought for control of the weapon. His words didn't make much sense, but his desperation was clear to everyone watching. He seemed to believe that getting hold of the rifle would somehow solve all the problems in his life that had brought him to this point. Johnson, meanwhile, was completely focused on maintaining control of his weapon. He had been trained for situations like this, but training and reality are always different. The adrenaline was pumping through his system, but his military experience helped him stay calm and think clearly about what he needed to do. The struggle lasted only seconds, but to everyone watching, it felt like much longer. Time seemed to slow down as two men fought over a loaded weapon in one of the most secure locations in Britain. The outcome of this struggle would determine whether the situation remained serious but contained, or whether it escalated into something much worse. Security cameras captured every moment from multiple angles. Radio chatter exploded across all the security channels as officers throughout the palace coordinated their response. Armed police were racing toward the scene, but they were still precious seconds away. For those few moments, everything depended on one guard's training and strength. Johnson knew that he couldn't let the rifle fall into the wrong hands no matter what. The safety of everyone in the area, including the hundreds of tourists still watching from outside the gates, depended on him maintaining control of his weapon. The man's desperation gave him strength, but Johnson's training and experience gave him something more important: the knowledge of exactly what to do in this situation. He had drilled for scenarios like this countless times, and now all that preparation was about to be put to the ultimate test. In moments like this, training becomes everything. All those hours of practice, all those drills that seemed repetitive and boring, suddenly become the difference between life and death. Guard Johnson's body moved automatically, following procedures that had been drilled into him thousands of times. Johnson was much stronger than the desperate man trying to take his weapon. 8 years of military service had built both his physical strength and his mental toughness. But more than that, he knew exactly what to do when someone tried to take his rifle. This scenario had been practiced over and over again until his response became instinctive. The first thing Johnson did was secure his grip on the weapon. His hands were positioned correctly on the rifle, giving him maximum control and leverage. The intruder was grabbing at the barrel and stock, but he didn't know proper weapon handling. His desperate grabbing actually worked against him, giving Johnson the advantage. Johnson used a defensive technique that every guard learns in training. Instead of just pulling back against the man's grip, he twisted the rifle in a specific way that broke the attacker's hold. The movement was sudden and unexpected, causing the man to stumble backward slightly. At the same time, Johnson activated his emergency radio with a quick press of a button on his equipment. The radio was connected directly to the Palace Security Command Center, and his distress signal immediately alerted every security officer in the building that a guard was under attack. The radio message was short but clear. Guard under attack. Main entrance, immediate assistance required. Those few words set off a chain reaction throughout the entire palace security system. Every available officer began moving toward Johnson's position at top speed. Johnson's military experience showed in how calm he remained during the struggle. While the attacker was panicking and fighting wildly, Johnson stayed focused and controlled. He had been in much more dangerous situations during his deployment in Afghanistan, where staying calm under pressure was literally a matter of survival. The man wasn't giving up easily. His desperation made him fight with surprising strength, but desperation without training is no match for skill and preparation. Johnson used his superior position and leverage to gradually gain more control of the situation. One advantage Johnson had was his knowledge of the rifle itself. He knew exactly how it worked, where the safety mechanisms were, and how to handle it safely even in a struggle. The attacker was just grabbing at whatever he could reach without understanding what he was trying to take. Johnson made sure to keep the rifle pointed in a safe direction throughout the struggle. Even while fighting to maintain control, his training ensured that the weapon never pointed toward the crowd of tourists or toward other guards. This kind of safety awareness under pressure is what separates professional soldiers from amateurs. The struggle was exhausting for both men, but Johnson was in much better physical condition. His daily fitness routines and military training had prepared him for exactly this kind of physical confrontation. The attacker, weakened by months of poor living and substance abuse, was already starting to tire. Johnson could see that backup was on the way. Other guards were moving toward him from different positions around the palace grounds. He just needed to maintain control for a few more seconds until help arrived. His training had taught him that in situations like this, time was always on the side of the security forces. The attacker seemed to realize that he was losing the struggle. His grip on the rifle was weakening, and Johnson's superior training was becoming obvious. But instead of giving up, the man became even more desperate, trying to use his body weight to knock Johnson off balance. This was another technique that Johnson had trained for. When someone tries to use their body weight against you, there are specific ways to counter it. Johnson planted his feet firmly and used his core strength to stay stable, turning the attacker's momentum against him. Throughout this entire struggle, Johnson never lost sight of the bigger picture. He knew that hundreds of people were watching, that news cameras might be recording everything, and that how he handled this situation would reflect on all the guards and the entire royal protection system. The radio crackled with updates as security teams coordinated their response. Johnson could hear that armed officers were just seconds away. He just needed to hold on a little longer, and the situation would be under control. Johnson's experience in real combat situations had taught him that most confrontations are decided in the first few seconds. The person who stays calm and uses their training correctly usually wins. The person who panics and fights wildly usually loses, no matter how strong or desperate they might be. As the struggle continued, it became clear that Johnson was winning. His grip on the rifle was secure, his position was stable, and his training was giving him every advantage. The attacker's strength was fading, and his wild grabbing was becoming less effective. But Johnson knew better than to get overconfident. Desperate people can be unpredictable, and the situation wasn't over until backup arrived and the man was completely under control. He maintained his focus and continued to follow his training, knowing that help was just moments away. The cavalry was coming, and they were coming fast. Johnson's distress call had triggered the most intensive security response protocol at Buckingham Palace. Within seconds of his radio message, every available security officer was racing toward his position from multiple directions. The first to arrive were 2 palace security guards who had been patrolling nearby. They had heard the commotion and were already moving when Johnson's call came through. These weren't ceremonial guards like Johnson. They were specially trained security professionals whose only job was to handle exactly this kind of situation. Behind them came armed police officers from the Metropolitan Police's Specialist Protection Unit. These officers are stationed around the palace specifically to respond to serious threats. They wear tactical gear and carry weapons designed to stop dangerous situations quickly and effectively. The man struggling with Johnson seemed to realize that his time was running out. He could hear shouting voices getting closer, and the sound of running feet on the palace grounds. His desperate attempt to get the rifle had failed, and now he was about to face the consequences of his actions. In a last-ditch effort to escape, he let go of the rifle and tried to run. But he had waited too long to make this decision. The security officers were already too close, and he had nowhere to go. The palace grounds are completely enclosed, and every exit was already being covered by additional security personnel. He made it about 10 steps before the first security officer reached him. The takedown was swift and professional. The officer hit him with a perfect tackle that brought him crashing to the ground hard. The man's body hit the palace lawn with a thud that could be heard by tourists still watching from outside the gates. But one officer wasn't enough to handle a desperate person who was still fighting. As soon as the first officer brought him down, 2 more security personnel arrived and joined the struggle. Now there were 3 trained professionals working together to subdue one panicked individual. The man tried to fight back, but he was completely outnumbered and outmatched. The security officers were trained in restraint techniques that allowed them to control him without causing unnecessary injury. They worked together like a well-oiled machine, each officer knowing exactly what the others were doing. Within 30 seconds of hitting the ground, the man's hands were secured behind his back with zip tie restraints. These plastic ties are incredibly strong and impossible to break once they're properly applied. The struggling was over, and the immediate threat had been eliminated. The speed of the response was incredible to watch. From the moment Johnson called for help to the moment the attacker was fully restrained, less than 90 seconds had passed. All that training, all those emergency drills had paid off perfectly when it really mattered. More officers continued to arrive even after the man was secured. Armed police formed a protective circle around the scene, their weapons ready in case there were additional threats they hadn't identified yet. Nobody was taking any chances that this might be part of a larger attack. The man was still shouting and struggling against his restraints, but his voice was getting weaker. The reality of what he had done and what was going to happen to him was starting to sink in. The anger and desperation that had driven him to this point were being replaced by fear and regret. Johnson finally relaxed his grip on his rifle, but he remained alert and ready. His part in the crisis was over, but the situation wasn't completely resolved yet. There were still procedures to follow and safety checks to complete before anyone could declare the area secure. The tourists watching from outside the palace gates were in complete shock. Many of them had their phones out and had recorded at least part of what happened. Within minutes, videos of the incident would be uploaded to social media and shared around the world. Palace security immediately began expanding their perimeter. Additional officers arrived to push the crowd of tourists farther back from the gates. What had started as a tourist attraction was now an active crime scene that needed to be secured and investigated. The man was dragged to his feet by the security officers, his hands still secured behind his back. He was no longer the aggressive, desperate person who had climbed the fence. Now he looked small and defeated, surrounded by professional security personnel who had completely overpowered him. Emergency medical personnel arrived to check both Johnson and the attacker for injuries. This is standard procedure after any physical confrontation, regardless of how minor it might seem. Johnson was fine, but the man had some cuts and bruises from his struggle and the hard takedown. The entire incident had been captured by multiple security cameras from different angles. This footage would be crucial evidence in the investigation and prosecution that would follow. Every second of the man's actions, from his initial approach to his final restraint, had been recorded in high definition. As the man was led away by security officers, he continued to shout about his problems and grievances, but nobody was listening to his complaints now. The time for talking was over, and the time for facing the consequences of his actions had begun. The scene on the palace grounds began to calm down as additional security sweeps confirmed that there were no other threats. But the impact of what had happened would be felt for much longer than the incident itself had lasted. As the security officers dragged the man away, still shouting and struggling against his restraints, Buckingham Palace immediately transformed from a tourist attraction into a fortress. The cheerful, relaxed atmosphere that had existed just minutes earlier was completely gone, replaced by the serious professional efficiency of a major security operation. The first priority was a complete lockdown of the entire area. Palace security protocols that had been planned and practiced for years were now being executed in real time. Every entrance and exit was sealed. Every tour group was immediately stopped and held in secure areas. Every visitor was instructed to remain exactly where they were until further notice. The tourists, who had been happily taking photos just minutes earlier, found themselves in the middle of a security nightmare. Hundreds of people were suddenly trapped behind police barriers, unable to leave or move freely. Children started crying as their parents tried to explain what was happening. Elderly visitors sat down on nearby benches, overwhelmed by the chaos. Tour guides did their best to keep their groups calm and informed, but they were just as confused as everyone else. None of them had ever experienced anything like this during their years of working at the palace. Their cheerful, rehearsed speeches about royal history seemed completely irrelevant now. Armed police officers appeared everywhere. They emerged from buildings, arrived in unmarked cars, and took positions at strategic points around the entire palace complex. These weren't the friendly, approachable officers who usually helped tourists with directions. These were serious tactical professionals with automatic weapons and protective gear. The bomb disposal team arrived within minutes, even though there was no specific threat of explosives. This is standard procedure after any security breach at a royal residence. Specially trained officers with detection equipment began systematic sweeps of the palace grounds and surrounding areas. Sniffer dogs were brought in to check for any dangerous materials that might have been left behind. The dogs and their handlers moved methodically through the crowd of tourists, checking bags and personal belongings. Most people cooperated willingly, understanding the seriousness of the situation. News helicopters began circling overhead as word of the incident spread. The distinctive sound of helicopter rotors added to the tension and confusion. Reporters were already gathering outside the security perimeter, trying to get information about what had happened. Inside the palace, emergency protocols were being followed to the letter. Even though the Queen wasn't in residence that day, her security team took no chances. Every room was checked, every staff member was accounted for, and every security system was tested to ensure nothing had been compromised. The incident had lasted less than 2 minutes from start to finish, but the aftermath would continue for hours. Modern security procedures don't take any shortcuts. Even when a threat appears to be neutralized, extensive checks must be completed before normal operations can resume. Social media exploded with posts from tourists who had witnessed the incident. Within minutes, shaky phone videos of the man climbing the fence and struggling with the guard were being shared thousands of times. The hashtag Buckingham Palace started trending worldwide as people tried to figure out what had happened. Palace communications staff worked frantically to manage the flow of information. They needed to balance public transparency with security concerns, providing enough information to stop rumors and speculation, without revealing details that could compromise future security operations. The man himself was taken to a secure holding area within the palace complex for initial questioning. He was still agitated and incoherent, making statements that didn't make much sense to the investigators trying to understand his motives. Medical personnel evaluated him to determine if he needed immediate treatment. Back outside, the crowd of stranded tourists was growing restless. People had flights to catch, hotel reservations to keep, and other plans for their day in London. But security protocols don't bend for convenience, and nobody was going anywhere until the all-clear was given. Street vendors who had been selling souvenirs and snacks to tourists found their day ruined by the lockdown. Their cheerful stalls sat empty as police barriers kept customers away. The normally bustling area around the palace had become an eerie, heavily guarded zone. Emergency services coordinated their response with military precision. Paramedics were on standby in case anyone in the crowd needed medical attention. Fire services were positioned nearby in case the situation escalated. Every agency with a role in royal protection was activated and ready. The investigation began immediately, even as security sweeps continued. Detectives started reviewing hours of security camera footage to trace the man's movements before the incident. They needed to understand how he had gotten to the palace, whether he had help, and if this was part of a larger plot. Johnson, the guard who had been attacked, was taken to a secure area for debriefing. Despite his professional handling of the situation, he would need to provide detailed statements about everything that had happened. His actions would be reviewed and analyzed to help improve future security procedures. The media attention was becoming intense. News vans lined the streets around the palace, and reporters were doing live broadcasts describing the little information they had been able to gather. The story was already making headlines around the world, with speculation about terrorism and royal security filling news websites and television screens. For the hundreds of tourists still trapped behind police barriers, the reality was setting in that their London vacation day was effectively over. What had started as an exciting visit to see the famous guards had turned into a frightening reminder of how quickly peaceful situations can become dangerous in today's world. 3 months later, the man who had shocked the world by attacking a guard at Buckingham Palace stood in a London courtroom to face the consequences of his actions. The confident, desperate person who had climbed the palace fence was gone, replaced by someone who looked smaller, quieter, and deeply ashamed of what he had done. The courtroom was packed with reporters, legal observers, and members of the public who had followed the case since that dramatic Tuesday morning. The judge, a stern woman with decades of experience in serious criminal cases, had reviewed all the evidence carefully before making her decision. The charges against him were serious and numerous. Attempted theft of a firearm carried a potential sentence of several years in prison. Trespassing on royal property was another serious offense. Threatening behavior toward a royal guard added even more time to his potential sentence. Each charge represented a different aspect of his dangerous actions that morning. His defense lawyer had tried to argue that mental health issues and substance abuse had impaired his judgment. Medical experts testified about the effects of alcohol addiction and depression on decision-making. Character witnesses described how different he had been before his life fell apart. But the judge made it clear that personal problems don't excuse dangerous criminal behavior. The prosecution painted a picture of someone who had chosen to put many people at risk through his selfish actions. They showed security camera footage of tourists running in panic, described the terror felt by families with children, and explained how his actions had cost taxpayers thousands of pounds in security response costs. When the judge announced the sentence, her words were clear and firm. 4 years in prison for attempted theft of a firearm, trespassing on royal property, and threatening behavior. The sentence reflected both the seriousness of his crimes and the need to send a message that such actions would never be tolerated. As he was led away to begin his prison sentence, his family members in the courtroom wept quietly. His mother later told reporters that she hoped her son would use his time in prison to get the help he needed with his addiction and mental health problems. During the trial, many details about the incident had come to light that weren't known immediately afterward. Investigators had traced his movements throughout London that morning, showing how his behavior had become increasingly erratic as he made his way to the palace. They found evidence of his financial troubles and the threats he had received from people he owed money to. The psychological evaluation revealed a man who had been struggling with feelings of powerlessness and resentment toward society. His attack on the guard wasn't really about the rifle or the royal family. It was a desperate attempt to feel important and powerful after months of feeling completely helpless. Guard Johnson received official recognition for his professional handling of the situation. At a ceremony held at the palace, he was awarded a commendation for bravery and exemplary conduct under pressure. His superior officers praised his calm response and perfect execution of his training during a dangerous situation. Johnson later gave interviews about the incident, emphasizing how important proper training is for security personnel. He described how his military experience had prepared him for the moment when everything depended on his ability to stay calm and follow procedures. His story became part of training materials for other guards and security officers. The incident led to a comprehensive review of security protocols at all royal residences. While investigators concluded that the existing systems had worked well, there were still lessons to be learned. New procedures were implemented to identify potentially dangerous individuals in crowds more quickly. Additional plainclothes security officers were assigned to patrol among tourists at popular royal sites. Better communication systems were installed to coordinate responses more effectively. Training programs were updated to include new scenarios based on what had happened that Tuesday morning. The hundreds of tourists who had witnessed the incident carried the memory with them long after their London vacations ended. Many of them spoke in interviews about how quickly their peaceful day had turned into something frightening. Several families said the experience had changed how they thought about security and safety while traveling. Mental health advocates used the case to highlight the need for better support systems for people struggling with addiction and financial problems. They argued that if the man had received proper help earlier, the incident might never have happened. Several new programs were launched to provide assistance to people in similar situations. The security camera footage from the incident became part of training materials for law enforcement agencies around the world. The rapid response and professional handling of the situation were studied as an example of how to manage similar threats effectively. 1 year after the incident, Johnson was promoted within the Palace Guard unit, partly in recognition of his exemplary conduct during the crisis. He continued to serve at various royal residences, knowing that his experience had made him a better guard and had contributed to improved security for everyone. The man who had caused all this chaos began participating in addiction recovery programs while in prison. His family reported that he seemed to be getting the help he had needed for so long. Whether he would be able to rebuild his life after his release remained to be seen, but at least he was finally addressing the problems that had led him to make such a terrible decision. The incident served as a reminder that even in our modern world, with all our technology and security measures, the most important factor in keeping people safe is still the training, professionalism, and courage of the individuals who stand guard. Sometimes everything comes down to one person doing their job correctly when it matters most.